Hey guys, since I've been getting super positive feedback from all of you on my previous review videos that I've been doing, I figured that I might as well add to the mix an individual review of my 2002 DRZ400S. I had the bike for 2 years and I put about 5,000 miles on it, and it was a super fun bike, and it was the bike that really got me into like harder enduro style riding and like more single track. And I don't mean like super intense enduro, I just mean like just kind of steered me towards a harder off-road bias instead of more street riding per se. Now, a lot of you that watched my previous videos know that I'm 6'7" and 280 pounds. So this bike was really put to the test with me on it, both suspension and chassis wise. So you're just going to have to keep that in mind when I'm talking about like suspension, chassis, and ergonomics. Before we start this review, I just want to state off the bat that I'm by no means an expert when it comes to riding. I'm definitely decent enough to keep myself upright in single track and like faster paced off-road situations, but I never did any MX riding or like racing on dirt bikes for that matter. Really, my only experience comes from like riding dual sports, for instance, and just riding them all the time off-road. With how I've been riding my WR250R recently, I know that I'd probably be better off just getting a dirt bike, but I don't like the maintenance intervals of dirt bikes, and I want a bike that I can ride on the street because I want to be able to connect trails. And I know there are performance bikes out there with plates, but those bikes are only reliable within their maintenance schedule. For instance, a DRZ or a WR, you're probably going to get 30 to 40,000 miles out of a top end. Whereas if you're talking like a 500 EXC or a CRF 450L, you're looking at 10 to 20,000 miles before you need a new piston, for instance. Now enough with all the blah blah blah, and let's get on with the review. So if I were to give this bike a definitive title, it would probably be Wheelie King. I will just go on a limb here and say that this is probably the most reliable wheelie machine that you can buy on the market. With stock gearing, even with my fat ass on it, I could clutch up fourth gear really easy, and this bike will power wheelie second gear all day long. If I were to go out and choose between all of the new supermotos that are currently on the market right now, or if I were to convert a bike to a supermoto, it would be a DRZ400. I know that the 701 and the 690 are just insane bikes with loads of power that are greatly balanced, but they just don't hit the reliability and the price point that the DRZ does. Plus, if I remember correctly, those bikes are 15 to 20 pounds heavier as well. The DRZ400 and WR250R are just gems in the dual sport market. And because of their maintenance schedule and how they perform, these two bikes are basically direct competitors with each other. There are no other bikes on the market that can perform as well as these bikes off-road while having 3,000 mile oil changes and 10,000 plus mile valve adjustments. But the one thing that the DRZ just absolutely kills the WR in is that low-end torque that it has. The WR makes somewhat similar power way up in its rev range, around 10 to 11,000 RPMs. But down low, as soon as you punch the throttle, the DRZ has its power. If you've ridden a 254-stroke dirt bike from any of the big manufacturers, the DRZ feels like those. I know a lot of you are probably thinking like, what? It's a 400 and it makes 250 power? You have to remember that these bikes have maintenance intervals that are measured in thousands of miles compared to a dirt bike that's measured in hours. And these motors are powering a lot of electronics, whereas the dirt bikes are usually just kickstart. So these motors have much bigger alternators, bigger cranks to keep the vibrations down. They're just very detuned compared to the dirt bikes. And I mean, yeah, that sucks, but at the same time, it's awesome, because that means these are motorcycles that you can also commute on and travel on and take adventures on. The DRZ and the WR are bikes that you can ride across the country, go on awesome single track with, and then ride back home thousands of miles, and you'll have to do very little maintenance, and that's what separates them from a dedicated dirt bike. Moving on from the power, another big win that the DRZ has over the WR is its aftermarket. There's just so many farkles and goodies available for this bike that it is just ridiculous. And if you're a taller guy like me, you won't have any trouble at all finding lowered foot pegs, taller seats, bar risers, bars, anything that you want to make this bike tailored to you. And that's not even mentioning the fact that this bike is built like an absolute tank. Out of the 2 years that I've owned this bike and probably the 100 times that I've dropped it, I don't even remember breaking anything besides like bars on this bike, for instance. It is just an absolute beast.
Oh. Ow. 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 That hurt.
So really one thing I'm trying to get at is that this bike is very high quality. Everything on this bike is super solid and the frame on it can handle a lot. So don't you worry one bit about packing this thing down with loads and loads and loads of luggage, including yourself, because this thing can handle it easily. One little nitpicky thing I will throw into this review though is that this bike has kind of a complicated oil change process compared to other oil changes on bikes. This bike has 3 drain plugs, one for the crankcase, one for the frame oil drain, and then the other one is for the oil filter drain. And then there's also a screen that comes out of the oil frame tank that you should be cleaning like every 3 or 4 oil changes. And then it doesn't stop there. To check the oil on the bike, you have to let the bike idle for 2 minutes, then you can check the oil level at the top of the frame, and that's about it for the oil change process. I figured I'd throw it in there because compared to the WR where it's just drain, fill, and look at the level and through the sight glass, that's pretty complicated. But anyways, I digress. Ergonomically speaking, this bike is kind of funky. You sit up really high on the bike, but the bars are really low, so it feels like you're sitting on top of the bike instead of inside of it. And then on top of that, the foot pegs are pretty high up on the frame when compared to other bikes, so it's a little bit cramped in stock form, but it's not that bad. But this is one of those things where the aftermarket comes in great handy because all of that is very easily remedied with aftermarket parts. And I can assure you that the stock cables allow for about 4 inches of bar rise, so you taller peeps like me won't have an issue raising the bars and controls at all. And just a quick tip, if you have trouble with the throttle cables reaching, just flip the throttle housing upside down. Now I want to talk about what I think is the worst thing about this bike. And this really only applies to tighter off-road situations. This isn't something you're going to notice when riding faster off-road or riding on the road in general. But in my opinion, the bike is very poorly balanced. Whenever I was riding this bike in tighter situations, it always felt top-heavy to me. So like just standing up at lower speeds and trying to maneuver and control the bike is just much more difficult when compared to lighter bikes like the WR250R or just dirt bikes in general. The DRZ is a great bike, don't get me wrong, but it does not have the dirt bike feeling that the WR250R gives you. It's just not as flickable and controllable, and you just can't go into berms as hard as you can with the WR250R. But I will say, with how the power is made and how this bike is set up, it's like the perfect bike for a taller beginner. As a beginner, it is much easier to ride this bike off-road than it is the WR250R because with the WR250R, you need loads of clutch input on tighter trails. With this bike at low speeds, how the power is made, you can just tractor through anything. It doesn't matter what the obstacle is, or it doesn't matter where you are. This thing just has the power to get you out of a weird situation that you're in without the clutch, which makes it really, really great for beginners. But at the same time, in certain situations, that power can actually get you in trouble. So in a way, it's sort of a double-edged sword. I'll leave a quick video example of me whiskey throttling into a tree.
That really hurt.
So enough with that. Another negative I want to talk to about this bike would be its on-road capability. One of my pet peeves about going online and reading up on the WR250R and DRZ400 is that a lot of people recommend the DRZ400 over the WR250R for road use, just because they think the power gives it the clear advantage, and that's just not true at all. The WR250R has much less vibrations at speed, its RPMs are running much lower, and it's a lot more stable than this bike is at speed. One thing you'll notice with this bike is that the front end feels extremely light when you're on the highway, which is not a good feeling at all when you're going 70 miles an hour on the interstate. I will say though that if your commute consists of roads that are 50 to 55 miles per hour or under, this bike will be perfect for you. And yes, at highway speeds it does have more passing power than the WR, but the bike is running like 6 to 7,000 RPMs just at 60 miles an hour, so that shouldn't be a surprise in itself. And then another big flaw of this bike is the carburetor, but not for the reasons you probably think. I honestly don't mind carburetors that much, but I absolutely hated the carb on this bike. The Mikuni BSR 36 is just a terrible carburetor. When you tip this bike over, there's no overflow, so all of the gas just overfills the carb, and when you tip the bike upright, you're going to be sitting there cranking it over for probably 2 to 3 minutes, and you just have to hold the throttle wide open until all of that gas gets out of there.
I can see you. Yeah. Start. Come on.
Whereas with other carbs, you'll just have gas dumping out of the overflow in the carb. But I'm pretty sure that that's an emissions thing regarding California laws for the DRZ, so I don't think there was a workaround for that. But this is obviously easily remedied with electron carb or a FCR carb. But that's an extra $500 to $600 you would have to spend on an issue that doesn't even exist on the WR250R. Now, suspension-wise, the suspension really isn't that bad at all. I know people go crazy about the upside-down forks, but I mean, it's not really that big of a difference. I guess really the main benefit you're getting from upside-down forks is that super extra rigidity you're getting in the triple clamp. It just gives you much better feedback from the trail and what's happening underneath you. But with this bike, the forks are still very large diameter and they don't have a lot of flex to them. So the forks do give you pretty good feedback, but the valving is really soft in them and it's pretty undersprung. And it's pretty much the same story with the rear shock too. Now, as far as the DRZ versus the WR250R and which one should you get, if you're going to be doing like really, really tight trails and like more so dirt bike riding a lot, I would go with the WR250R. But if you're going to be doing like more dual sport style riding that doesn't involve a lot of interstate and stuff like that, the DRZ would honestly be a much better option. Especially in a supermoto trim around the city, the DRZ would be so much fun. Just like ripping wheelies all over the place on this thing is just a blast in itself. But if you're going to go on like long adventures that involve like really technical single track and stuff, I would honestly go with the WR250R instead because like I said, the WR250R is better on highway and interstate even though it doesn't really have a lot of power to like pass cars at those speeds and stuff. It'll keep you at speed, and once you get to the trail, it's going to be a lot more fun on single track and technical trails than it will be on the DRZ, just because of how the bike is balanced. Owning both of these bikes for multiple years now, I would just much rather ride the WR250R as the highway cruiser because it's that much more comfortable in my opinion. If I had to put it in a different perspective, I would say that the DRZ is like your backcountry fun bike, whereas the WR250R is like your dirt bike that will go on the highway. I think I've said just about all that I can about this bike. If you guys have any questions, please PM me or leave a comment. But I really appreciate all the positive feedback I've been getting. You guys are awesome. And thank you so much for watching. Have a good one, guys.